Pause for a moment and imagine this. You are staring at an old photograph, faded by time, its edges worn, its surface cracked. At first glance, nothing seems unusual. Two young faces, same eyes, same jawline, same calm, confident posture. You assume they are brothers, maybe even twins. But then you learn the truth. One of them is the master's son, the other is his slave, and suddenly that photograph stops being ordinary. It becomes dangerous. This single image confused everyone who saw it. Historians, archivists, families who believed they knew their past, because it showed something that was never meant to be seen so clearly. It exposed a truth that written records worked hard to hide. A truth about bloodlines, power, and silence. A truth that could not be erased once the image existed. In a world where slavery was built on strict divisions, this photograph broke every rule. It challenged the idea that race, status, and family were separate. It forced people to ask questions they were never supposed to ask. How could a slave look exactly like the master's son? What kind of secret produces a resemblance this precise? And why was this image allowed to survive when so many records were destroyed? This video is not just about a photograph. It is about what happens when truth slips through the cracks of history. You will learn how slavery created hidden families that society refused to acknowledge. You will see how power allowed some people to claim ownership over others, while still sharing blood with them. And you will understand why photographs became one of the most dangerous forms of evidence, because they show what words try to avoid. What makes this story important is not just the shock, it is the pattern behind it. This was not an isolated incident. It happened more often than history books admit. Enslaved women were forced into silence. Their children inherited faces, not names, and entire generations lived in the shadow of men who would never claim them, even when the mirror told the truth. As you watch till the end, you will begin to see slavery differently, not just as chains and labor, but as a system that twisted family itself. A system where a father could own his own child, where resemblance became a liability, where the truth had to be hidden, because admitting it would collapse the lie that kept the system alive. This story matters because history is not just what is written, it is what is denied. And sometimes, all it takes is one photograph to expose everything. Stay with this video, because what you are about to discover is not just uncomfortable, it is revealing. And once you see it, you will never look at the past, or old photographs, the same way again. Before we talk about the documents, the dates, or the explanations historians would later attempt, we need to stay with the image itself. The photograph does not shout. It does not accuse. It simply presents two figures standing side by side, calm and composed, as if unaware of the storm their likeness would one day create. At first glance, the eye is drawn to the symmetry between them. The same face shape, the same width of the forehead, the same quiet confidence resting in their expressions. Before we talk about the meaning behind that resemblance, notice the eyes. They are not just similar in color, but in depth and placement. Both pairs sit at the same distance, framed by the same brow line, carrying the same steady gaze. It is the kind of resemblance that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. These are not features shaped by environment or imitation. These are inherited markers, passed down without permission, without acknowledgement, without mercy. Before we talk about posture and body language, understand that posture is not something easily copied. One figure stands with shoulders slightly back, weight balanced, chin lifted just enough to suggest certainty. The other mirrors this stance almost perfectly. Even the angle of their heads feels rehearsed, though it could not have been. This is not mimicry. This is instinct. The body remembering what the mind was never allowed to claim. Before we talk about clothing or status, focus on how the resemblance ignores everything society tried to enforce. One wears garments of privilege. The other wears the plain dress of ownership. Yet the contrast only sharpens the similarity. The same hands hang at their sides, the same long fingers, the same proportions. The photograph does not allow the viewer to look away. It demands comparison, and in doing so it quietly dismantles the story of separation. Before we talk about how people reacted, consider the shock of recognition. Anyone seeing this image for the first time feels it immediately, even without context. The brain searches for explanations that do not involve betrayal or violence. Cousins. distant relatives, anything but the truth. But the longer you look, the harder denial becomes. Faces do not lie this clearly by accident. Before we talk about what this resemblance meant for their lives, sit with the silence inside the image. Neither figure is smiling. Neither appears surprised. There is no rebellion in their eyes, no fear either. Just a shared stillness, as if both understood something unspoken, as if one carried entitlement without question, and the other carried the same blood without protection. Before we talk about history's attempt to explain this away, recognize that this photograph captured more than likeness. It captured contradiction. It showed how a system built on control could not control biology, how power could dictate names, labor, and fate, but not faces. And in that quiet, unchanging image, the truth remained visible long after every witness was gone. Before we talk about the photograph becoming public, we need to understand the world it came from. This was a society built on rigid lines, where race was not just identity but law. Every rule, written and unwritten, existed to protect one group's power and deny another's humanity. These boundaries were enforced daily, through punishment, fear, and public example. Any challenge to them, even a silent one, was considered a threat. Before we talk about resemblance itself, we must talk about classification. People were sorted at birth, sometimes with a single glance. Skin tone, hair texture, and facial structure were used as tools of control. These visual cues decided who could speak freely, who could own property, and who could be owned. A face that blurred those categories disrupted the entire system. It raised questions that the system was never designed to answer. Before we talk about family, understand that enslaved people were legally denied it. They could not claim fathers. They could not pass down names. Children followed the status of the mother, not the blood of the father. This rule protected enslavers from responsibility, while allowing them access. It ensured that even when bloodlines crossed, power remained untouched. A resemblance that revealed shared blood exposed this contradiction. Before we talk about danger, recognize how fear maintained order. If a slave could look like the master's son, then race was no longer proof of superiority. Authority depended on the belief that difference was natural and absolute. A shared face threatened that belief. It suggested that the hierarchy was built on violence, not destiny. That idea alone was enough to provoke punishment. Before we talk about punishment, consider how silence was enforced. Enslaved people were taught, often brutally, that acknowledgement could cost their lives. Speaking the truth was not just risky, it was forbidden. Even those who noticed the resemblance learned to look away. Survival depended on denial. The system rewarded blindness and crushed curiosity. Before we talk about the master's household, understand reputation. White families guarded their public image fiercely. Honor was currency. A visible mixed-race child challenged claims of moral authority and racial purity. It hinted at abuse, coercion, and hypocrisy. The presence of such a resemblance within the same space was a liability that had to be controlled, hidden, or erased. Before we talk about law, remember that courts did not protect the enslaved. They protected property. A slave who looked too much like the master's son threatened inheritance lines, ownership claims, and social order. Even the suggestion of equality could destabilize wealth and power passed through generations. Before we talk about why this resemblance survived at all, sit with the risk it carried. A shared face was evidence without words. It could not testify, but it did not need to. In a world obsessed with separation, resemblance was rebellion, and that made it dangerous. Before we talk about his name appearing in records, we need to understand how he existed inside the household. He was not a field laborer sent out of sight. He lived close to the center of daily life, moving through rooms where decisions were made and conversations were held. His presence was constant, yet his identity was carefully controlled. He was seen, but never acknowledged as more than his assigned role. Before we talk about his duties, it is important to see why he was kept inside. He performed work that required trust. He handled personal items. He carried messages. He assisted with tasks that demanded discretion and obedience. This position placed him in proximity to power, but offered none of it in return. The closer he stood to authority, the more carefully he had to disappear. Before we talk about how others treated him, notice the contradictions. He was relied upon, yet denied recognition, spoken to, yet not listened to. He moved with quiet efficiency, trained to anticipate needs before they were voiced. This skill was not accidental. It was learned under pressure, shaped by consequences. A mistake could bring punishment. Excellence brought only survival. Before we talk about his appearance, understand why it mattered so much in this setting. Inside the household, faces were noticed. Visitors noticed. Family members noticed. Servants noticed. His resemblance to the master's son was not hidden here. It existed in hallways and doorways, in shared spaces where glances lingered longer than words. This made his position both valuable and dangerous. Before we talk about how he was addressed, recognize the language used around him. He was called by first name only, never by title, never by relation. Words were chosen carefully to maintain distance. Language reinforced hierarchy. It reminded everyone who belonged and who did not, even when faces suggested otherwise. Before we talk about his inner life, consider the discipline required to survive in such a role. He had to regulate his expressions, his tone, his posture. Any sign of confidence could be misread as defiance. Any silence could be interpreted as insolence. He learned to be present without presence, visible without voice. Before we talk about records and labels, understand that his value to the household was functional, not human. He was an extension of routine, a tool shaped like a person. Yet his constant proximity made it impossible to fully deny his humanity. The contradiction followed him through every task. Before we talk about how history remembers him, stay with how the household used him. He stood between worlds without belonging to either. Inside the home, he served. Outside it he vanished into the category of property. And all the while, his face carried a resemblance that no position, no rule, and no silence could fully erase. Before we talk about the children born from these unions, we need to understand how carefully the relationships themselves were concealed. Slave owners lived in a world where power allowed access, but reputation demanded silence. What happened behind closed doors was protected by status, fear, and law. Enslaved women had no right to refuse, and no right to speak afterward. This imbalance made secrecy easy and denial effortless. Before we talk about consent, it is important to recognize how language was used to blur reality. These relationships were never named for what they were dismissed as rumors, framed as moral failings of the enslaved, or erased entirely from records. The master's authority ensured that his version of events became the only version that survived. Before we talk about households, understand that proximity made abuse possible. Enslaved women assigned to domestic work were constantly observed, yet completely unprotected. They slept near the family, served meals, cared for children, and moved through private spaces. This closeness was presented as trust, but it was exposure. Power followed them everywhere, and there was no refuge from it. Before we talk about pregnancy, consider how the system responded when evidence appeared. A child with lighter skin or familiar features threatened public image. The solution was control. Mothers were moved to distant quarters. Children were sold or reassigned. Paperwork reduced lives to inventory, shifting attention away from origin and toward ownership. Before we talk about the role of white women in these households, understand the limits placed on their awareness. Some suspected. Some knew. Some were forced into silence by dependency and social expectation. The system discouraged confrontation, because acknowledging the truth meant confronting violence, betrayal, and loss of status. Before we talk about records, recognize how absence was intentional. Births were logged without fathers. Names were omitted. Ages were adjusted. Ledgers spoke in numbers, not stories. This was not oversight. It was design. A written confession would have consequences. Silence carried none. Before we talk about morality, see how the system protected itself. Laws defined children by the status of the mother, not the father. This single rule allowed slave owners to benefit from exploitation without responsibility. Blood could be shared, but rights could not. The law absorbed the contradiction and turned it into profit. Before we talk about how history uncovered these relationships, stay with the mechanisms of hiding. Fear kept women quiet. Power erased evidence. Respectability masked abuse. What survived were fragments, faces, rumors, resemblances that refused to disappear. And in those fragments, the truth waited, patient and unresolved. Before we talk about how historians later reconstructed these lives, we need to understand how deliberately they were removed in the first place. Family records were not neutral documents. They were tools used to protect reputation, inheritance, and power. When a child complicated that story, the solution was simple. The child was written out. Before we talk about birth records, it is important to see how names disappeared. Many mixed-race children were never given surnames connected to their fathers. They were listed with a single name, or with none at all. This was not a clerical mistake. A name creates connection. Without it, lineage collapses. The absence of a name was a barrier, carefully placed. Before we talk about family trees, understand how they were curated. White family genealogies traced bloodlines with precision, recording marriages, heirs and property transfers. At the same time, enslaved children who shared that blood were excluded entirely. Trees grew upward and outward, but never downward into the quarters where inconvenient truth lived. Before we talk about household Bibles, recognize their role as private history books. Births, deaths, and marriages were often written by hand inside them, yet mixed-race children were rarely included. Pages that documented generations skipped over them completely. Silence in these sacred records gave moral cover to omission. Before we talk about legal documents, consider how paperwork reduced people to assets. Bills of sale, inventories, and estate lists mentioned children only as property, not as descendants. Ages were recorded, values assigned, but relationships erased. A child could appear in a ledger without ever appearing in a family's memory. Before we talk about public acknowledgement, understand the fear behind it. Claiming these children meant admitting exploitation. It meant threatening inheritance lines and social standing. It meant breaking the illusion of racial purity that upheld authority. Erasure was easier than truth. Before we talk about relocation, notice how distance helped disappearance. Children were sent away, sold or placed in other households. Physical separation supported record separation. Once removed, it became easier to pretend they never existed. Before we talk about what survived, stay with what was lost. Erasure did not require burning documents. It required selective memory. It required choosing which lives deserved ink, and which deserved silence. Mixed-race children existed in the margins, seen, used, and forgotten on paper, while their resemblance lingered in photographs, waiting to expose what records refused to say. Before we talk about what historians wrote decades later, we need to focus on what the camera captured in a single instant. Photography did not ask permission. It did not negotiate language. It recorded light, shadow, shape, and proportion exactly as they appeared. In a world skilled at bending words, this new technology became dangerous because it refused to interpret. It only showed. Before we talk about written records, understand how easily language could be shaped. Words could soften violence. Titles could disguise abuse. Ledgers could reduce people to numbers. Entire lives could be summarized in a line that revealed nothing. Photography disrupted this control. A face could not be footnoted away. A resemblance could not be edited without destroying the image itself. Before we talk about intention, recognize that many photographs were not taken to expose truth. They were taken for memory, status, or curiosity. Yet once captured, the image escaped its original purpose. Decades later, viewers noticed what the photographer may have ignored or accepted as normal. The camera preserved details, without understanding their consequences. Before we talk about faces, focus on how the human brain responds to visual evidence. We are trained to recognize patterns, especially in features. When two people share the same eyes, nose, and structure, the connection is immediate. No explanation is required. Photography allowed this recognition to happen across generations, long after witnesses were gone. Before we talk about silence, consider how images speak without words. They do not accuse, but they suggest. They do not argue, but they insist. A photograph invites comparison, and comparison invites questions. Why do these two look alike? Why are they dressed differently? Why are they standing where they are? The image forces inquiry without offering answers. Before we talk about censorship, understand how difficult photographs were to control once they existed. They could be hidden, but not rewritten. They could be misplaced, but not reworded. Unlike letters, they did not rely on the author's honesty. They waited patiently, ready to be seen again. Before we talk about modern interpretation, remember that photography collapsed distance. It brought the past into the present. It allowed people who never lived under those rules to witness their contradictions. A single image could reveal what generations of documents avoided. Before we talk about the power of evidence, stay with the quiet resistance of the photograph. It did not speak loudly. It did not demand justice. It simply remained. And in remaining, it preserved a truth that words worked very hard to hide. Before we talk about official interpretations, we need to understand the first reaction. When historians and viewers noticed the resemblance, it was not met with immediate explanation, but with silence. A pause. The kind that happens when something familiar appears in an unexpected place. Faces were studied longer than usual. Details were revisited. The image demanded more attention than anyone planned to give. Before we talk about academic responses, consider the emotional reaction of ordinary viewers. Many felt confusion before shock. The resemblance challenged assumptions they did not realize they carried. Some tried to rationalize it away. Others felt discomfort they could not easily name. The photograph created a quiet unease, because it suggested a truth that did not fit neatly into the stories people had been taught. Before we talk about professional caution, understand how historians are trained. Claims require evidence. Words require proof. A photograph alone does not tell a full story, yet it can point toward one. Scholars approached the image carefully, comparing facial structures, timelines, and household records. The resemblance was discussed in measured language, even as its implications pressed heavily beneath the surface. Before we talk about debate, notice how quickly discussion turned to patterns. Once one resemblance was acknowledged, others were remembered. Similar images surfaced. Similar accounts reappeared. The photograph stopped being an anomaly and began to feel familiar. What once seemed impossible started to look systemic. Before we talk about resistance, recognize that not everyone accepted the implications. Some dismissed the resemblance as coincidence. Others argued that photography could deceive. There was a clear discomfort in allowing the image to disrupt established narratives. Acceptance meant confronting exploitation and hypocrisy that extended beyond a single household. Before we talk about public reaction, observe how audiences engaged with the image once it was shared more widely. People lingered on it. They compared features. They asked questions in commentaries and archives. The photograph became less about the individuals in it and more about what it represented. It forced viewers to reconsider how many similar truths had been overlooked. Before we talk about language, understand how carefully responses were framed. Terms like possibility, suggestion, and likelihood appeared often. This was not uncertainty alone. It was caution. Naming the truth carried weight, and weight carries consequence. Before we talk about long-term impact, stay with the moment of recognition, that instant when resemblance was seen and could not be unseen. In that moment, the photograph stopped being historical material and became a challenge. It asked viewers, scholars, and descendants to confront what history had quietly allowed to pass without explanation. Before we talk about the photograph again, we need to examine the documents that were meant to record life, ownership, and lineage. On paper, everything appeared orderly. Names, dates, transactions, and inventories were carefully logged. Yet in these same pages, the truth of relationships, of bloodlines, and of resemblance was nowhere to be found. The documents avoided naming it directly, but they could not erase the evidence entirely. Before we talk about explicit confessions, notice how records often relied on omission. Births of mixed-race children were recorded without fathers. Slaves were listed as property, with ages and values noted, but any connection to the master was erased. Ledgers reduced humans to numbers, carefully sidestepping inconvenient realities. The paper remained clean, but the story beneath it was still alive. Before we talk about ownership lists, understand how patterns emerged. Scholars tracing names and dates began to notice repetitions. Certain women consistently produced children at specific intervals. Certain children were regularly relocated, sold or assigned new roles within households. Alone, each record seemed innocuous. Together they revealed a rhythm that could not be accidental. Before we talk about inheritance documents, see how absence spoke volumes. While the master's legitimate heirs were meticulously traced, children who shared the same features, the same eyes, the same posture, were absent from wills and estate claims. The lack of recognition became a signal in itself. Silence, in these records, was not neutrality, it was deliberate concealment. Before we talk about letters and private writings, notice how indirect references provided clues. Mentions of the boy in the household, or the daughter moved elsewhere, were coded language. Names were avoided, but context hinted at deeper truths. Observers who read between the lines could reconstruct relationships that the authors were determined to hide. Before we talk about patterns across households, realize that the repetition was undeniable. Mixed-race children appearing at similar ages, assigned to similar duties, moving through the same spaces. These were patterns that no document could erase. When viewed collectively, the ledger, letters and inventories formed a network of evidence far stronger than any confession could provide. Before we talk about official histories, understand that these patterns eventually forced acknowledgement. Even when individual records were silent, the accumulation of data created a story impossible to ignore. It revealed what was denied in speech, erased in writing, and hidden in plain sight. Before we talk about interpretation, recognize that the power of patterns lies in their persistence. They allow truth to emerge even when language fails. Each omission, each silent record, each coded phrase, contributes to a web of reality. The documents avoided naming the truth, but their structure, repetition and gaps spoke clearly to those willing to read them carefully. Before we talk about the modern understanding, stay with the idea that absence can be as revealing as presence. What the authors of these records hoped to hide became visible not through confession, but through the careful observation of repetition, timing, and connection. Patterns never lie, even when words do. Slavery was not just about labor or ownership. It was about control over every aspect of life, including family itself. Children born of enslaved women often shared the same blood as their owners, yet they were denied recognition, denied names, denied families. Property and family became intertwined in ways that were painful, complicated, and unjust. Faces, resemblances, and even photographs quietly revealed truths that records tried to erase. They remind us that history is not always what is written, it is also what survives, what is hidden, and what demands to be seen. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful insights from history that challenge what we think we know.